Hello, Mr. Crow here, and I want to talk about dominant and recessive alleles. But before we do that, I'd like to review a little bit of what we've learned already. Remember, in Google Classroom, you started at the very bottom of the ladder with learning about proteins, and you've been working up that ladder of learning as you've learned about proteins and genes and transcription, translation, and inheritance and traits. And so I just want to review a little bit. And you know that we have these things called genes, and genes can get translated. Okay, and remember, genes have codes that will lead to the formation of a protein, but the genes get transcribed into mRNA, and that mRNA then gets translated into protein. And it's that protein that gives us our traits. And traits are physical characteristics that you can see or not see. The ones that you can see in people are things like eye color and hair color. The traits that you can't see are things like enzymes that do jobs in our body. So we have these traits, and we inherit these traits from our parents and when two gametes fuse. So remember, we get our traits from the gametes, and the gametes are a result of meiosis. And in meiosis, we get these haploid cells, meaning they only have half the number of chromosomes that an organism needs to survive, and it needs to fuse with another haploid cell so that the individual can have all the genes for survival. And so the gametes are known as sex cells, and in humans, we have sperm and egg. So we get our traits when these haploid cells, like sperm and eggs, male and female, when these cells fuse, they create a diploid cell that has all the genes an organism needs to survive. And these genes are on what are called homologous chromosomes. And so that's a kind of a big word, so let's write it down. So we got these homologous chromosomes. And in ancient Greek, homo means same. And this part comes from a ancient Greek word called logos, which can mean ratio. So we get our genes in the same ratio when we inherit them from our parents. You get one set from your father and one set from your mother. Okay, so we get these homologous chromosomes that we inherit from both parents. And on these chromosomes, we have genes. And this is where we get to this word allele. Okay, and an allele is different versions of the same gene. And the example of a gene that we're going to use is freckles. So a person can inherit a gene from both parents, so they have two versions of this gene. The version can either be what's called dominant or recessive. And in the case of freckles, if a person has a dominant gene for freckles, then they will definitely have freckles. If they have two recessive alleles for freckles, they will not have freckles. So let's look at this person right here. This person has two dominant alleles for freckles, and we're going to represent those alleles with a capital F. So they get a dominant allele from the father and a dominant allele for freckles from the mother. And so this individual will definitely have freckles. Okay? And so the person showing the freckles, we call that the phenotype. okay, is how that gene is expressed, the phenotype. The genotype, meaning how those genes are on the chromosomes, is called the genotype. The genotype here is that this person has two dominant alleles, and this is how it's expressed in the genotype. Okay, so this individual would be homozygous dominant, meaning they have the same two alleles on the homologous chromosomes. So we would call that homozygous dominant for freckles. They have two dominant alleles. That's what that means. Okay? All right, let's look at the next person. So on their homologous chromosomes, they will have one dominant allele, okay? And they will have one recessive allele. And we're going to represent the recessive allele as a lowercase f. Now remember, this one's for no freckles. This one is for freckles. So this person is what's called heterozygous. And their phenotype is, even though they have freckles, they're a little different from the previous individual. They have one dominant allele, and then they have one recessive allele. And that makes this person heterozygous. For freckles. Okay? That means they have one dominant and one recessive allele. Okay? They're heterozygous for freckles. The next person is what's called homozygous recessive. And so they're going to have two versions, or just two recessive alleles on each chromosome. Okay? And we represent that as lowercase f's. And so this person has a genotype where they're homozygous recessive, and their phenotype is they do not have freckles. Okay? So that's how dominant and recessive alleles work. Remember, alleles are different versions of the same gene. The example we use, freckles, meaning that you've got a dominant allele for freckles, and if a person has one dominant allele for freckles, they're definitely going to have freckles. But if they have two recessive alleles for freckles, then they will not have freckles. Okay? And that is a little bit about dominant and recessive alleles.